so good evening everyone, and thank you for being here and for those of you listening in. So let's get straight into it. As we go through the history of Trinidad and Tobago's amphibians, I've decided to highlight these key time periods / publications which have all laid the groundwork and foundation for what we know about amphibians in the country. Starting off, I decided to start off in 1969 with Kenny's Amphibia of Trinidad, and then roughly 30 years later, John Murphy's book, the big one, The Amphibians and Reptiles of Trinidad and Tobago, which is then updated in the field guide, the Amphibians and Reptiles of Trinidad and Tobago field guide, Murphy and colleagues, and then sort of kind of showcase what we have done this year, some of the publications from 2023 relating to amphibians and their conservation in Trinidad and Tobago, and sort of summarize what we know so far and what could be geared towards future directions towards improving amphibian conservation. Now, when people from Trinidad and Tobago first think about amphibians in the country, this is what comes to mind more often than not. This is the crapo or cane toad. It's what most people locally are familiar with because it usually shows up in your yard and it's everywhere. But we have a high diversity of amphibians in the country. They come in different shapes, different sizes, different colors. So it's not just the cane toad or crapo. We do have some really nice looking frogs that I think some people might appreciate more than the crapo or cane toad. And this is just a snapshot of some of the species here. There are more. So starting up with Kenny's 1969 publication, Amphibia of Trinidad. It's based on just Trinidad frogs. And it really had laid groundwork for what we know about the amphibians here in the country. I've highlighted a couple of quotes that I sort of picked up from reading through it that would kind of play a role later on in the presentation, as you may see. So firstly, he noted that since Parker's 1933 list, which was just a checklist, there was nothing more to it, the names of 9 of the 23 species then have changed in one way or another, even at the genus level, while 2 unrecorded species have been found. For those of you who might be more familiar, nowadays the names of these frogs are changing, but since then they have been changing. So also Kenny noted that surprisingly little recorded information have been recorded on the general life history of the frogs, particularly the Trinidad species, and that's including the ones that are also represented in mainland South America. The Parker's list was really just what was here. We didn't know much else about them. So this is what Kenny set out to do. Over the course of roughly 10 years, Kenny would have carried out surveys. If you look at the figure 4, Kenny would have carried out surveys across Trinidad, including areas like Cedros, Carcos, Nariva, El Tacuch, and all those little dots in between the island as well. And from that, he recorded 25 species, so 2 additional ones from the additional 1923 list. He would have provided data on the distribution of species, the habitat preferences, and also identification keys. The latter I'll go through after, but just looking at the figure on the right, it shows the distribution of 4 different frog species on Trinidad. Now, you might not recognize some of these names if you're familiar with frog names, but the one on the top left is the golden tree frog, and he would have recorded it at El Tacuch. At the time, that's only Eden Survey Cerebral records, that's only the distribution record he had. For the paradox frog, bottom left, mostly the southwest peninsula, but as well Nariva Swamp, and a little piece in the northwest. And then for these other species as well. But of course, you can see this is the groundwork that he set out and laid for what we know about where these species are found, the type of habitats they prefer. So for example, in the river swamp, we have an idea of a kind of swampy marsh area. So certain frogs would like that as opposed to others. For example, the golden tree frog, high elevation, usually that kind of elfin woodland forest, not really going to be found in the river swamp. So this is one of the key things that Kenny produced for the first time, an identification key for the tadpoles, in particular how to identify them. For those of you who probably are familiar or study butterflies, The adults are pretty much more straightforward in terms of how you identify them to an extent, whereas with caterpillars, maybe not so much. So you can kind of relate, because it kind of applies to amphibians as well with tadpoles. They're a little bit more difficult to the untrained eye to identify. They're smaller, they're aquatic, and superficially they might look similar to each other if they're within the same family. So to kind of find a way to help the layperson actually be able to identify these tadpoles and amphibian biologists as well, he created a key to identify species based on their physical features. Now the key ones I'm highlighting here are the mouth parts and the teeth as well. The two figures are two different frog species, and if you look at the mouth, which is the bottom figure from looking at the ventral surface of the tadpoles, like this view here, the mouth is pretty much shaped differently, and the teeth as well. You will actually need to look at this under a light microscope to take a closer look, but that's one of the key ways to distinguish tadpoles. Some of them are pretty easy to identify, like the paradox frog. It's huge, it can only be that. Some of them you can't tell based on where they are found, like the crabbo usually lays their tadpoles in sitting areas, tundra frog as well. But for others within the same family, like some tree frogs within the Dendrosophus genus, they look very similar. So you actually need to look at the mouth parts and to be able to identify them. So if you or anyone is interested in doing work on tadpoles to identify them, you do need to look at their mouth parts. And then sort of to wrap up, Kenny's section, he also produced a key for the adults. They're a little bit more straightforward, but back then, most people would know how to identify the Trinidad street frog from a ditch frog maybe. But there are certain key features as well that you use to identify them. Again, it's the physical features that you can see. Some of them are a little bit more straightforward. Once you see an adult cane toad, it's pretty straightforward to identify. But again, when you're looking at species in the same family or different families, it's good to have this key when you're starting off with, that is. Nowadays we have a lot more photographs and stuff that you could kind of get accustomed to and get familiarized. But if you want to start off looking at a sure way to physically identify them, this is what they did back then. Of course, now then you have things like DNA. So one thing I have mentioned that I think is a way to highlight, if you want to start off identifying frogs, there are the tree frogs, and then you have the more terrestrial-based frogs. If you're not sure which one is in which group, tree frogs, within their toes, they all have webbing, always, without doubt. Whereas in the more terrestrial-based frogs, think of the crabbo or the Trinidad stream frog, they're more terrestrial-based, they have no webbing in between their toes. So it's one of the key ways to start off being able to identify and distinguish between the groups of families. There are other features as well, the size, the disc on their toes, like the peeper, but that's very distinguishable, so you shouldn't be able to mistake that one. And yeah, that's what Kenny did, laying that groundwork for identifying tadpoles and adults. So moving on, roughly 30 years later, John Murphy would have compiled this book. Most of the members might have this if you're interested in those. And he would have documented 37 species suspected. So I've underlined suspected because he would have used both field surveys and literature reports, as well as museum specimens, to kind of collate all the species that he believed would have been in the island at the time, that Kenny would not have been able to do at the time. It's suspected because some of these are literature based, and they're a bit dubious, and that's why he made sure and put it as suspected. Now he would have provided data on the natural history, distribution, and habitat preferences, kind of updating what Kenny would have done. And just to kind of go through the differences in the names, as I would have highlighted a quote from Kenny in the beginning. On the left, you see the names of all the frog species in Trinidad that Kenny would have recorded. And I've kind of like just compiled the ones from Murphy's book at the time that correspond to the ones from Kenny. And you would see, just looking at the top, peeper is still peeper. It hasn't changed. Just to note, the names in the brackets are the describers. But the first two names are the scientific name, just to focus on. Whereas some names have changed. So Manophrine trinitatis, which is the Trinidad stream frog, was Phalobates trinitatis. So in this case, the genus name has changed. And one of the reasons for the changes in the names is because over time, with different emerging tools, we're better able to actually know more about the lineages of frogs. So back in the day, we once thought they were from this branch of family, but with emerging tools, for example, DNA and other advanced technology, we found that they're actually from this lineage of family. So that's why some of the genus names or species names are changing. Well, the genus name in particular. If it's a species, a different species. And just to kind of highlight again how the book is structured, for those of you who might have it or might not, but he provided maps showing the distribution of species. So in this case, I've highlighted the paradox frog because earlier on, Kenny, he only noted it in the southwest, the east coast by Nariva, and a little piece by northwest Port of Spain. But here, Murphy actually also has it further southeast and a bit more north central. So over time, in this case 30 years or so, Murphy would have had additional records of the species across Trinidad. And this is something that is continuously happening, and with continuous monitoring, we can actually learn more that one species that we thought was only found in one part of the island is actually elsewhere. And as well, habitat preferences and natural history. You can't really read it here, but that's fine. If you have the book, it basically gives a detailed account of, for example, in this case, this frog here, Skynax ruber. They are mostly savanna and grassland frogs. In other countries, they're called bathroom frogs. If a frog has ever come in your bathroom and it's tiny and brown, it's probably this. And yeah, so you have an idea of where they're found. And this information is pertinent because we can use it to better protect them, because we have an idea of what kind of habitats, what kind of conditions that they can actually acclimatize to and are accustomed living with. Right, so moving on again to 2018, the field guide, which of course is available from the Field Naturalist Club. This is a Field Naturalist publication. 35 species. This is set from the previous 1997 book. So over the past 20 odd years, we would have done continuous surveys since then to kind of remove those suspected species and verify that what is and actually what isn't here. And we're a bit more confident to say that there are 35 species at the moment of frogs in the country. It would have provided this field guide, updated data on the distribution. Again, over time, you're going to have species being found, extra areas, additional areas. The natural history, for example, their biology in this case, and some new species named. Again, the names have changed again. And then, for example, so it looks like Peeper will remain Peeper because it hasn't changed for the past, well, since Linnaeus described it, which is well over 100 years. And Manophrine has remained since 1997. But if you go to the fourth row, looking at just 1997 and 2018, you'll notice Pristimantis eurigae was previously a different genus name. So it's assigned to this genus based on how I explained it previously. We know a little bit more about the lineage to actually assign to this specific genus, which is the first part of the scientific name. And here's another example of how the field guide would kind of like showcase the distribution of species. And I've just highlighted one example here, not to drag it on. The Trinidad stream frog. So we know it's concentrated mostly across the northern range and the central range. Most of these records are based on literature and museum specimens. For incidental observations, we know they are also in that little northeast corner where you're not seeing any records there, like Matura and Granaville. They are there, but there are no museum specimens from there. But they are across the entire northern range, from Chagaramas all the way to Togo, and then the central range as well. When it comes to natural history, the field guide provides additional information that Kenny probably would not have noted way back in the 60s, just because it takes a little bit more time to see these natural events play out. For example, parental care. This is the Trinidad stream frog again, and we know now that we didn't know 50 years ago that the males exhibit paternal parental care. So in the top right corner, that's the male with his little tadpoles on his back, and he's transporting them from one pool of water to another, usually where there's less competition from either other tadpoles or other fish that would eat them. And now we reach 2023. So this chapter kind of came out this year in this book, which is on, you could check it on those online stores, Amphibians and their Conservation in Trinidad and Tobago. I've sort of just grouped it based on this chapter, but I'm also going to be highlighting other publications from this year that are related to the history of amphibians. So it provides data on distribution, natural history, the current state, and ongoing threats. Just to kind of highlight again, since 2018, 2 more name changes to 2 additional frogs. It's going to keep happening, folks. And another example of how we would have described the distribution of species, this is just the beep's toad. The text basically just says it's found in Trinidad only. This is the other toad species, by the way, not the cane toad or crackle. It's a little bit smaller. And they like more grassland areas, low elevation. That's what we know about them. Just an example. Now this is something I wanted to kind of highlight here. It's too soon for me to actually reveal this, just because it's actually currently being reviewed in a journal. So because of that, I'm kind of blocked by actually playing a video here. But there's a video of the golden tree frogs, male, and we have described the call for the first time. And when I say describe the call, it's been recorded and quantified on a system, and we actually show how the wavelengths vary across time, the frequency of the call, that is. And we actually have an idea of what the call sounds like and its reproductive behavior. Now this is currently, hopefully should be out next year. Maybe at next year's members meeting I can actually showcase this to all of you all interested. But it would be really, it was too soon to put it in the presentation this time, so sorry about that. But something to look forward to. Now this is just a 2-part slide. The next slide will kind of continue on where I explain this. But in terms of the global state of the world's amphibians, amphibian species are more threatened than all the terrestrial vertebrate groups. So there are more amphibian species threatened with extinction than birds, mammals, and reptiles. Looking at the graph on the right, it just showcases the different conservation categories. So the light green, if you can see it, are the species that are least concerned. I think it's like 44% or something like that. Whereas all the other colors are the threatened categories, with the red being critically endangered, orange being endangered, and so forth. The gray is data deficient. I personally would, to me, I would refer to that as being threatened because you just don't know enough about the species, meaning they're not widespread enough to even see them, so they probably are threatened. So more than half of all the amphibian species, I would say, are actually threatened, potentially with extinction. But when it comes to Trinidad's 35 species, so you're just focusing on the species we have here, 30 of the 35 are actually least concerned. Least concerned being they're not that threatened with extinction. So that's roughly 85%. Now that's good compared to the global average, and it's likely attributed to the fact that most of our frog species here are also found in mainland South America. So they're quite widespread, so the chance of them going extinct is actually reduced because of that larger area of occupancy. But we do have 4 threatened species and 1 data deficient species. These being the golden tree frog, which is endangered. It was particularly endangered, but it's been downgraded to endangered because a population has been discovered in Venezuela. Again, larger area of occupancy. And these 4 others are all Tobago endemic species or subspecies. The Tobago stream frog, the Charleville litter frog, the Tobago glass frog, and this here, the Turpin's litter frog. This being the data deficient one, which we would have advised the IUCN to give all these categories based on what we know of it so far. We know it's in the main ridge. We don't know how far extent it is in the main ridge, or if it's even outside the main ridge. So we just don't know enough to assign confidently a conservation status, whether it's vulnerable or dangerous. It's probably going to be either or, I suspect. In terms of ongoing threats to amphibians, these are the major ones that would apply to other species as well. Climate change. I think we can all notice it's feeling a lot hotter these days. Can you imagine how the frogs are going to feel that? Because they have semi-permeable skin, so they dry out a lot quicker. Habitat loss. When you cut down the habitat, there's no place for it to eat or sleep or otherwise. Pollution. I don't need to say much more about that. Exploitation, which is less than a threat here in Trinidad frogs. I don't think Trinidadians or Tobagonians are eating frogs. But in Dominica, there's a mountain chicken frog that people do exploit. Invasive species. So far, it seems like most of the invasive species are restricted to urban areas, less so getting into the forested areas, natural areas, so less of a threat at the moment. But also diseases. And I've just kind of highlighted this here, which is just a publication that has, where we detected a fungal pathogen in the golden tree frog, which of course is one of the endangered species, And this fungus is important because it has caused the extinction of frog species in other countries. So this is a major conservation concern for the endangered golden tree frog here in Trinidad. It's based off of 11 specimens tested in Iltacooch. So we know it's detected in Iltacooch, but we don't know what's actually causing this disease spread in the fungus in Iltacooch. It does occur naturally, but climate change and as well human influence could actually exacerbate the fungus from spreading more or less. This is something that really requires urgent attention, so hopefully it can be addressed. Like for example, is it also in Trinidad and what is actually causing the spread of the fungus? And just a little bit of a plug here for myself, because based on the, I'm actually currently doing research on amphibians here in the country as part of my research project, thanks to help from club members and others as well. It's all across the country, Trinidad and Tobago, including the main ridge, hiking up Cerro del Ripo there, and all these other habitats. And I'm looking at how the calling activity varies as a consequence or attributed to the different environmental conditions. So the environmental conditions actually cause the calling activity to differ or vary. And this is important because frogs call, in particular the males call to advertise the intent to mate with a female. So the more the calls are calling less, you might have less reproduction actually occurring with these frogs. And the environmental conditions actually affect that calling behavior. So just in summary, as I kind of wrap up here, over the past 50 odd years, Kenny and Murphy and others have provided a foundation for what we know about Trinidad and Tobago's amphibians. We know where most species are found, and again, we're still discovering additional areas for lesser known species. We know the habitats they prefer: forest, urban, swamp, marsh, high, low elevation. And we know some aspects of the natural history, but not all. We're still discovering additional things, whether it's predation events or whether it's different calling activity cycles. We still don't know actually a lot of that information yet. And we do know the conservation status for almost all, but we have limited knowledge on how major threats are impacting local species, with the disease example as an example. So I've sort of just highlighted 4 different things to kind of advocate for towards improving the conservation of amphibians here, because all the history has kind of laid the ground for what we know, and I don't want that to just disappear, because I mean it'll be catastrophic for us as well too. So the first up is what is always needed is additional monitoring. And over the years, you've seen with additional monitoring, more information is gathered, and with more information, we can actually better protect the species, because we have a better idea of what they prefer or what is better needed for them. Greater collaborations. This is important because a lot of times we have scientists, trained scientists, trying to do work in areas without local collaborations, and you need that community assistance as well, and vice versa. I mean, we both have the same aim of wanting to protect either the natural species or the natural land. So we do need to actually advocate for greater collaboration. More involvement from key stakeholders, state and private. Again, we do see people talking about how flooding is a major issue for us humans, and that is true. But we don't really hear much about how important, we need to save the frogs. We do, because at the end of the day, they are beneficial to the environment and us. And as well, this is linked to funding for amphibian conservation research and education. Again, I've seen push for other taxonomic groups where funding is really geared towards and less so towards amphibians. And yet, if I go back, if I refer to that slide, amphibians are more threatened with extinction than all other terrestrial vertebrate groups. So just to kind of acknowledge some of the key persons, again, I've referred to some of them, but these are a few others as well. Kenny, Murphy, Downey, Lieutenant Jaws, Hardy, Erie. These are some of the people who would have done work over the past from the 60s all the way to the 2010 or so, but also acknowledging the community scientists and naturalists, the Free Naturalist Club members, of course, iNaturalist users. When you post a photo of a frog to iNaturalist, you actually do contribute to amphibian conservation, because we get records of where they are, and that actually is beneficial. All the volunteers and students, for example, who come into BioBlitz, that is also beneficial to amphibian conservation. And as well as the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, they have reached out to me as well to get input on the conservation status of amphibians, so that actually does play a role, as you can use that status to advocate for other things. So that's the end of the presentation, so thank you very much.